Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics. We keep hearing the deal that'll tackle unionist concerns over the post-Brexit trade arrangements is done, but what exactly does it look like? We'll spell out what we understand is on the table. There may be a wave of optimism in many quarters that the DUP is preparing to return to Stormont, but the future of public sector pay deals still hangs in the balance. We'll hear why TransLink workers are staging another walkout this week. While the DUP is in sharp focus on this side of the border, it's Sinn Féin and especially its plans to visit the White House on St Patrick's Day that's under the spotlight in the Republic. We'll have the latest. And we'll have another film in our series, The State We're In, including the views of this worker from a children's cancer charity.
We're finding that our young people in particular and families are struggling with deciding whether they can afford to put food on the table or make it to their appointment to have their treatment.
And with me throughout to offer her insight and analysis, the Northern editor of the Irish Times, Freya McClements. As things stand, we appear to be reaching the end game. The DUP executive is meeting tomorrow night, very possibly to decide on whether or not the party should return to Stormont. And the details of the new arrangements proposed around the Irish Sea border have begun to emerge. Let's speak to our economics and business editor, John Campbell. John, you've got some sense of what you think is likely to be on the table for the DUP to consider. Just talk us through it.
Yeah, I should preface this by saying I haven't seen the deal. I haven't been directly briefed on its contents, but there are various things which are now in the public domain and also some of our own reporting. So the big development this week is around this issue of divergence and the government's promise effectively to limit divergence between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, so rendering the Irish Sea border less complicated in the future. And just to take a couple of steps back on that, we are of course in the position where Northern Ireland is still inside the EU single market for goods. GB is outside. So as GB and the EU change their rules, update their legislation, that could potentially create more barriers across the Irish Sea, make the Irish Sea border more complicated to operate. And post the Windsor Framework, it's this issue of divergence which is really of greatest concern to the business community for the longer term. So what we learned this week from the Daily Telegraph story was that the government would more or less say to unionism, we will not pursue policies which will cause active divergence with the EU in a way which would cause the Irish Sea border to be more complicated. So policies would have to be screened to make sure that they didn't further disrupt the workings of the UK internal market. I think what's less clear is if the government is promising not to actively diverge, would it also promise to actively converge with any updates to EU legislation? Because remember, divergence can happen either through the UK legislating or the EU legislating. Now, Theresa May was offering that sort of idea of dynamic alignment, as it's called, way back in 2019. Not clear if that's on the agenda this time in exactly the same way. One other thing which is very clearly in the public domain is that there will be a promise to legislate to further reinforce unfettered access for goods going from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. And we know this because there was an exchange in the House of Commons before Christmas where Jeffrey Donaldson really asked that question, will you do this? And the Prime Minister more or less said, yes, I will, as long as you're back in. OK, two things I need to ask you. First of all, can you see why Sir Jeffrey Donaldson and his supporters, including, of course, the UK government, will argue this is a substantial package that properly addresses unionist concerns? I suppose around the issue of limiting divergence, they can say that is significant because it involves an element of political risk for Rishi Sunak at a time when he's already looking a little bit shaky. He was effectively have to say to some of his Brexit supporters, some of the promises of ripping up the EU rule book, all that sort of stuff, that is going to be limited for the sake of the union. You can see that is an argument which could be advanced and would be used to say that the deal has some real substance to it. OK, we may well hear quite a lot of argument along those lines then in the next few days. But equally, my second point, can you see why opponents of the deal are likely to argue there's nothing of substance in it? I can, because the Windsor Framework hasn't been reopened. The negotiations between the UK and the EU have not been restarted as part of this process. Now, I understand that UK officials have been in touch with their EU counterparts to further explore what flexibilities exist within the realms of the Windsor Framework. And I suppose one of the big unanswered questions for me at the moment is Sir Geoffrey Donaldson has been looking to reduce the number of controls which goods would face as they go through the so-called green lane. Has there been any progress made there, something tangible that can be pointed to? But I think, we already see this from some of the things Jim Allister has been saying over the last 24 to 48 hours, is if the sort of deal which we're hearing about is the one which is on the table, it won't address some of those fundamental issues that some of the hardliners would want to see addressed.
Yeah, well, we will see. Fascinating stuff. Perhaps we'll get a bit more detail, perhaps in the next 48, 72 hours. John, for now, thanks very much indeed. If you want a bit more detail on all of that, by the way, John has written a very good piece on the BBC News NI website. It's worth taking a look at that. Now, let's pick up on that discussion and talk to my guest of the day, Freya McClements, the Northern Editor of the Irish Times. John's outlined what he thinks, what his best guess is to what's likely to be in this deal. Do you think, on the basis of that, Sir Geoffrey can sell it to enough of his party members to make the political progress that he wants and that others want?
Well, I think we're going to find out in the near future. The UK government are clearly throwing the kitchen sink at this to try and get the DUP over the line. And on the one hand, it does mean that Geoffrey Donaldson can go back to the party, can go back to the officers, that executive, and say, well, look at all the concessions that we've achieved by staying out, even since December. If you compare to what was on the table in December, he can plausibly say, look, by taking that bit of extra time, because we didn't do a deal in December, we've got more. The flip side of this is that, and John outlined this really well, there's still a border in the Irish Sea. The Windsor Framework hasn't been renegotiated, and there's a broader problem here, because if what we're talking about the UK government saying that there will not be further divergence, well then, what have these last years all been about? What, in fact, was Brexit about? And the DUP are a party that pursued a hard Brexit. So there's a question there for them to grapple with, and I'm sure the likes of Jim Allister will not be behind the door in pointing that out. I
would have thought not. We'll come on to his opposition and the opposition of others in just a moment or two, but I just wonder, this has all been kept very tight. Are you hearing anything at all, Freya, about the choreography as far as the officer team and the party executive's concerned? We know the executive meets 7 o'clock on Monday. We don't know where. Maybe that will emerge beforehand, but we don't really know where the officers fit into that. Do they meet before or after that critical executive meeting?
Yeah, it's just not clear, and this has been one of the characteristics of all of this, is that the DUP leadership have tried to keep this really, really tight, and in fact we only know that there's an executive meeting on Monday because it was leaked, and we've seen the impact that these leaks have had in terms of disrupting this process. Obviously it's in the interests of those who don't want the DUP to go back in to have as much of a media spotlight put on this as possible.
And we know that internally there is opposition from people like Nigel Dodds, Maurice Morrow, Sammy Wilson, Ian Paisley, we understand. Externally, people like Jim Allister and his supporters. How concerted an effort might there be, do you think, to try to derail this process entirely? And if that happens, then what?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely going to be a concerted effort, and those people, the people that you've listed, the people who are against going back in, are absolutely going to up the ante in the coming days, because really now is the time for Geoffrey Donaldson when it's in or out, and yeah, I think it's all going to move quickly from here on.
It's going to be a big week in politics here, I think, no matter what happens. Freya, for now, thank you very much indeed. We'll talk to you again, of course, a little bit later in the programme. But let's pause and hear from two people working on the front line about just how challenging life is for some families at the moment. This is the latest in our series, The State We're In.
My name is Raymond Jackson. I'm the Chief Executive here at the Confederation of Community Groups based in Ballywot House in Newry. We're a community development organisation, and we have about 250 community voluntary sector organisations on our books. We provide capacity building support to a large number of those, and in particular we work in areas of deprivation. A lot of the issues undergoing at the moment is cost of living crisis and poverty, including food poverty. We're also dealing with a lot of hardship issues at the minute, so we are helping the community and voluntary sector. We're sitting along with statutory partners in order to deliver, for instance, hardship funding, and without us being in that position, it wouldn't, that funding wouldn't reach those people most in need. The biggest issue we've got is short-term funding. Many of our funding streams, as with the community voluntary sector in general, is that a lot of the programmes are going to end now on the 31st of March. and we have no letters of offer then going into the future. We hope to get extensions of funding, etc., but it's all short-term stuff, so it's not strategic, and it's very difficult for us to plan a way forward. We need a functioning executive, so we need the boycott to end, we need Stormont to be reformed, and we need the executive to be in place. And that will then allow the departments then to make longer term strategic decisions, including funding of the community and voluntary sector, which is we're crying out for at the moment. We would really need the executive to reform, to carry out services, also to address the short term cost of living stuff, but really to deal with the anti-poverty strategy and wider neighbourhood renewal programmes, etc., which are beneficial to our local communities.
My name is Simon Darby. I'm a social worker for Young Lives versus Cancer here in Northern Ireland. We support children, young people and families impacted by cancer. We do that across various different streams, thinking about the emotional impact, so whether people need to access support for siblings, counselling services, psychology services, connecting young people with other young people with cancer and parents also. On a practical level, it's how do they navigate through their education whilst with cancer diagnosis, coming out or returning back into education and employment after you've been through cancer treatment. Parents, how do they navigate the financial impact of having a child, or if you're a young person and your finances have significantly been impacted. So we're having families and parents trying to navigate a cost of living crisis on top of caring for a child who has cancer. With regards kind of returning back into education and employment, our young people are sometimes finding that harder now at this stage because the pressure to get back into work is greater because they don't have the financial means to be able to sustain, a recovery period after their treatment. The grants that we provided last year compared to this year are up by £7,000, so we've done quite a few more grants this year because we're finding that our young people in particular and families are struggling with deciding whether they can afford to put food on the table or make it to their appointment to have their treatment. And we've had young people who haven't been able to afford to make it to the hospital to get their treatment, and we're having to rely on other organisations and charities to help fill that gap. My message to our politicians would be to listen and hear what our families and our young people and children are going through, hear and understand the impact that cancer has on work, on the family unit themselves, on employment, so that they can better serve Northern Ireland.
And if you're involved with a group encountering similar problems, you can get in touch with us on email at bbcpoliticsni@bbc.co.uk, and we've already filmed with some of the organisations that have got in touch with us after seeing the series on the programme. Now, looking ahead to next week, there's another strike by transport workers planned for this Thursday. TransLink workers will walk out on February the 1st, bringing the public transport network to a standstill for 24 hours. Alan Perry is a senior organiser with the GMB union, and he's with me now in the studio. Welcome to you. We're looking then at another strike. If strike action didn't work before Christmas, why do you think it'll be any more successful this time?
Well, we would disagree, Mark. We would firmly believe that strike action has played a significant part in the Secretary of State increasing the pot of money that's available for public sector pay. Unfortunately, that money is not on the table as of yet, and certainly that's why the strike's continuing on Thursday. Yeah,
but the pressure that huge public sector strike of not very long ago had was to not move the Secretary of State at all, because despite pleas from workers and despite pleas from other politicians in Northern Ireland, he is steadfastly holding on to his purse of money.
And that's why the anger and the frustration is growing, not only within TransLink, but right across the public sector. As we've seen on the 18th of January, 170,000 trade unionists right across the civil service, health, education and transport coming together, clearly sending a clear message to the Secretary of State, enough is enough, and he needs to use whatever leverage he has to release that money, and release that money now.
Of course, he has said repeatedly that he doesn't have the authority to do that, that the money is available, but it is part of an overall package involving the return of Stormont, and until Stormont comes back, that 600 odd million can't be given to public sector workers. That's his line.
Yeah, and as you know, the trade unions have no leverage in relation to restoring Stormont. We have seen on previous occasions where the Secretary of State has legislated outside of his remit in relation to certain things. So there's nothing, we believe, to stop him releasing that money now. He has said it is available, and why will he not put it in our members' pockets?
Yeah, but he's explained why he won't, and you simply calling for him repeatedly to do it doesn't seem to be having any impact. And in the meantime, you've got several thousand workers coming out on strike that's going to seriously impact on ordinary people who are not going to find it easy to get to work, to get to hospital appointments on Thursday. You say the public are behind you. They might start to get a little bit cheesed off with this, and that support could begin to dissipate.
Yeah, I mean, we firmly believe the public are with us at this moment in time. We've got to remember our members live in the very communities that they serve. They don't want to be on strike. They'd rather be taking people to their hospital appointments, taking kids to school and everything else. But ultimately, they have no other choice at this moment in time but to partake in action.
Well, they do have another choice, and I suppose the other choice is to wait and see what happens, because we've already been discussing on this programme there is the potential for very significant political movement this week. We know this big DUP meeting is happening tomorrow night. Would it not be better to set aside the strike action on Thursday on the basis that there may be the political movement that you want to actually allow that money to be released? I mean, it's a tricky political situation at the moment, and the argument is this kind of strike action doesn't help.
It doesn't help, but it could be avoidable.
Why are you doing it if it doesn't help?
But it could be avoidable, Mark, and I think that is the key here. We want Stormont up and running like anybody else. We have called out previously around we would rather be dealing with local ministers, but that is not the case, and that's why the anger, the frustration is building towards the Secretary of State, who has dangled that carrot among our members. We have no control in relation to when Stormont gets up and running, hence why the focus is on the Secretary of State at this moment in time.
Yeah, but you've just said strike action doesn't help. You uttered those words, strike action doesn't help. So if strike action doesn't help, why are you pushing ahead with it at a very sensitive time in the politics of Northern Ireland? The waters are already muddied. Why are you muddying them, arguably, even further?
Because our members, Mark, have voted for industrial action. Our members are the ones without a decent pay rise. We're fighting for protection of public services right across the board. And of course we want the institutions up and running, but they're not at this moment in time.
Okay, so let me ask you this question.
Until such time, then we have to continue with the action.
Well, until such time. So let me just tease that out a little bit. This meeting is happening on Monday night. There is one argument. I'm sure you've seen it in the papers, and you've probably heard it on the radio as well. Theoretically, if everything goes according to plan for Jeffrey Donaldson, it is possible, I think, that Stormont could be up and running by the middle of the week. Maybe a first meeting on Thursday. That's the day of your planned strike action. If that was to be the case, and you knew for sure that Stormont was coming back, and the Secretary of State said this money is tied up with Stormont coming back, would you at that point, Tuesday, Wednesday, call the action off?
I mean, that is something we may consider, but ultimately we haven't seen what is in the detail. That is the key here, Mark. He has said there's 600 million. Is that enough to address public sector pay? We don't believe it is, because we don't have the detail. So that's why we continue to lobby in relation to obviously trying to find that out. So until such times we have the detail, strikes continue.
So that pretty much means that we're going to have strike action on Thursday, because it's kind of impossible to imagine Stormont could be back on Thursday and all the clarity that you say you need would be available to you for that to happen. So people are just going to have to accept that there's going to be major disruption come Thursday.
That would be correct, but of course we would say that is regrettable and is avoidable.
Okay, all right. We'll see what happens. I appreciate your time, Anna Perry. Thank you very much indeed for coming in to join us. Now, it's just 7 weeks to St Patrick's Day, when the traditional exodus of politicians from this island takes place. Political leaders from both sides of the border descend on the White House for the annual Shamrock ceremony. This year could be the final St Patrick's Day shindig for Joe Biden, of course, the most Irish of presidents. But the conflict in Gaza has led to some on the left calling for politicians to boycott the event. Sinn Féin confirmed via social media that Michelle O'Neill and Mary Lou McDonald will indeed travel to Washington to make the case against Israel's military action. Let's discuss the politics behind this now with Gavin Riley, political correspondent of Virgin Media News. Gavin, Sinn Féin's known, of course, for strategising all its big decisions. What's behind the decision to go to the White House this year, do you think?
I suspect when it comes to the rubber meeting the road, Mark, what we'll see is that Sinn Féin now recognise that if they were to follow by the usual ideological route that they might have done in previous years, that they then find it very difficult to settle very nicely into government. As you say, Sinn Féin leadership from north and south have made regular annual visits to Washington every year for the last decade or more, particularly since Sinn Féin became the largest nationalist party in the north. And for those of us who are there every St. Patrick's Day myself, usually covering the visit of the Taoiseach to the White House, it is very obvious that America does celebrate power sharing in Northern Ireland. You might even argue in some ways that it was America's last great foreign policy intervention, getting involved in shepherding those talks in Northern Ireland that did lead at least to sustained peace, if not to sustained devolved power sharing. So America does like to make a big deal of Northern Ireland at least being very peaceful, even if it isn't particularly functional. And to that degree, then Sinn Féin would find itself in a very tricky position if it simply decided now would not be the time to continue engaging in the White House, because there is always a view, certainly within diplomats in Dublin at least, that if there were to be any year where the St. Patrick's Day festivities were allowed to slip down the agenda, particularly if you might find next year that Joe Biden, that most Irish of presidents, isn't in Washington, you might find it very difficult to get that access back going again. The Irish lobby is still a very vocal one in Washington, but it's not as powerful as it used to be. And from a practical sense, Sinn Féin might be fueled by a concern that if they were to allow the audience slide this year, it might be a situation where they find it very difficult to ever get it back.
Yeah, there is clearly a challenge here for the Sinn Féin leadership. There is internal concern about the party's strategy on this. I mean, in a speech in the Dáil this week, the party's Louth TD Imelda Munster criticised the naked hypocrisy and cowardice of world leaders when it comes to apartheid Israel's genocide in Gaza. The party has consistently called for the Irish government to join South Africa's case against Israel at The Hague. Do you think calls like that, Gavin, will have to be dialed down if the party does indeed travel to the White House, as is currently the plan?
I suspect to a point. I mean, one does have to bear in mind that any audience that Sinn Féin might have in the White House or on Capitol Hill is largely because of its status as the largest party north of the border, and not because it might be a government in waiting in the south. So there's always a framing of any engagement that Sinn Féin has. There might have to be a certain reining back, but also there might now be a point where, because Sinn Féin is getting such flack for this decision to continue with its usual engagements, in spite of all those calls for there to be a boycott of the festivities, it may in fact have to dial it up, that it may have to perform to its domestic audience and try to vindicate this idea that if it's going, because if the sales message that Sinn Féin is now giving to its electorates on both sides of the border here in the island is that they need to go to America to engage, to make the argument to people who might not otherwise hear it, you then have to follow through and put forward that argument, because there's no point in going over and trying to dial it down, because that would dilute the whole purpose of making the journey in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting you use that phrase, dialling it up, because the former party president, Gerry Adams, weighed into the debate, as you will know, on Friday, when he made it clear he supports the current leaders travelling to Washington to directly raise the Palestinian issue with senior figures in the US, as he put it. And he said people who are criticising the leadership don't really understand where Sinn Féin is on this issue, and has been in the past.
Yeah, there is a view in diplomatic circles in Dublin that diplomacy has always been of a contact sport. If you just permit me a very brief tangent, when you had the likes of Micheál Martin going to Israel and Palestine in late October, early November, with a view to securing the release of Irish hostages who were trapped in Gaza, no sooner had he gone there than effectively he got what he wanted. So there is this view in official circles that if you want diplomatic outcomes, you do have to go and press the flesh, so to speak. On the intervention of Gerry Adams, I do think that was a very strategically timed intervention. You mentioned in your introduction that Sinn Féin is known to very carefully strategize all of these things. Gerry Adams' interventions in any matters of live political debate have been fairly few and far between since he stood down as party leadership. There was this view within Sinn Féin that they didn't want there to be any question of Gerry Adams still speaking over Mary Lou McDonald's shoulder, that she was now the president of the party and that she wasn't answering to anyone else. But yet there has always been that view that perhaps if Sinn Féin was facing any difficult political issues domestically, that Gerry Adams was always there. It was almost in case of glass, break out Gerry Adams and see what he thinks, because such as Gerry Adams standing still within the provisional movement, that there'd be no question at all of anyone questioning him. And if he says you have to go over and make the case, basically saying that diplomacy is a contact sport, very few people are going to challenge him on that.
Gavin, just finally and briefly, we've about 30 seconds left. On a separate note, what do you make of the party's decision to run the Fermanagh South Tyrone MP Michelle Gildernew in the European elections in the vast Midlands North West constituency?
It's certainly very fascinating that Sinn Féin is actually going for 2 seats in that constituency, because they currently only hold 1. And now that we see opinion polls maybe not necessarily in their favour, it is ambitious and does risk splitting the vote. One might say domestically, it does suggest that Sinn Féin are very confident of their numbers in Fermanagh and South Tyrone, because if Michelle Gildernew were elected, of course, to be a parliamentary by-election, we know how tight those seats have been in the past. It might say more about Sinn Féin's view of things north of the border than it does about their electoral prospects in the south.
OK, Gavin, got to leave it there. Thank you very much as ever. Let's just have a final word with my guest of the day, Freya McClements. Let's just pick up with that news about Michelle Gildernew. What do you make of Sinn Féin moving her over the border to run in the European election later this year?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And I think Gavin's absolutely spot on. It says something about Sinn Féin's confidence in Fermanagh, South Tyrone, that they can afford to potentially take out somebody who is, she's a long-standing MP. I mean, aside from a couple of years, she's been the MP for 20 years. She's high profile in the party. She was agriculture minister in Northern Ireland. She's well regarded and from a well regarded family in that area. Bearing in mind, Fermanagh South Tyrone is always tight. I mean, she won by 57 votes the last time. It's always the constituency where it comes right down to the wire. So the Sinn Féin feel that they could potentially take her out of that, take a punt at a second seat in the European Parliament and bring in another candidate and still win it. I think it says something about how confident they are in Fermanagh South Tyrone.
Fascinating to find out who that candidate is going to be in due course, because the general election's not very far away either, of course.
Yeah.
And just on this theme, because there have been other interesting moves we should talk about as well, the Ulster Unionist Party, last party to take that seat from Sinn Féin, it's started the general election campaign early, you might say, by announcing a few of its candidates. Let's just talk first of all about Robin Swan moving as well and hoping to knock out the DUP in South Antrim. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's a smart move because Robin Swan, again, really popular politician, health minister during the COVID-19 crisis, and somebody who would have an appeal beyond the traditional UUP base. If you take him to South Antrim, obviously he is North Antrim, and if you take him to South Antrim, the DUP, Paul Girvan, has a majority of around 3,000. If you look at all the other votes available in that constituency, you've around 20,000 the last time that went to Alliance, Sinn Féin and the SDLP. I'm sure there's quite a few of those will be more than happy to vote for Robin Swan as the UUP candidate. So I think they have a chance there of unseating.
That's very interesting, and one we'll be keeping a close eye on. Earlier in the week, of course, Doug Beattie unveiled another surprise when he revealed the UUP candidate in North Down.
Yeah, Tim Collins, absolutely. And again, somebody who's high profile, who you would expect would have an appeal beyond your traditional UUP base. I think that's a bit more of a punt. I can't see him really threatening Stephen Farry. But I think, again, if we broaden the lens out a little bit, if we look at the big numbers game, at the minute it's 8-7 DUP to Sinn Féin in terms of Westminster seats. If Robin Swan did take that seat in South Antrim, and everything stays the same, you're down to 7-7. That's the DUP's majority gone there as well. So really interesting.
Really interesting, fascinating politics coming up in the weeks and months ahead, possibly. Freya, thank you very much as ever. That's all we've time for today. I'll be back on Thursday with The View at the usual time of 10:40 on BBC One. It could be a busy political week ahead. And in case you missed it, last week's programme, in which we discussed just how close the big moment is for Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, is still available on iPlayer. But for now, from all of us, thanks for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.